Welcome in, folks. Today I'm joined by Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, who I'll provide an introduction for. Welcome, Robin. It's great to have you here.
Cool. Good to be here.
And we're also joined by John Downs, former executive director of Microdosing Collective. John, it's great to have you with us. Welcome.
Great to be here.
It'll be mostly Robin and I in discussion and dialogue around microdosing versus SSRIs. John is also going to share a little bit around what's going on with the Microdosing Collective. Without further ado, Robin, I'm gonna kick us off. I have a ChatGPT generated bio that I'll first read for you, and then I have an initial question, and we can start off with that question. It'll provide the initial context.
Sure.
For joining today. Here we are. Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris is a pioneering neuroscientist and psychopharmacologist renowned for his groundbreaking research into the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. He currently holds the Ralph Metzner Distinguished Professorship in Neurology and Psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco, where he also serves as director of the Psychedelics Division at Neuroscape, a translational neuroscience center. Prior to his tenure at UCSF, Dr. Carhart-Harris founded and led the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, the first institution of its kind globally, where he conducted pioneering studies using neuroimaging to explore the effects of substances like LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, and DMT on the human brain. His work has been instrumental in advancing our understanding of how psychedelics can be used to treat mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, and addiction. Notably, especially for this webinar, Dr. Carhart-Harris led a landmark randomized controlled trial comparing the efficacy of psilocybin-assisted therapy to the SSRI escitalopram, which you can probably pronounce better than I can, in treating major depressive disorder. The study found that psilocybin produced rapid and sustained antidepressant effects comparable to those of this SSRI, with some indications of greater efficacy in certain measures. Robin will also be, this is my little plug, Robin will also be joining us in Costa Rica in November for a practitioner intensive that we're hosting through the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. And he has a book on the way that he's been hard at work around called How Psychedelics Work. And we'll share a link to his website so you can sign up for the email list to get notifications of when that is coming out. So Robin, a lot of big words there, but it's great to have you joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, always a pleasure. Looking forward to this.
So I'd love to start with the clinical research and some of the context is, there have been over 29 million SSRI prescriptions written alone in the last year or so, and rising rates of mental illness. And I'm curious, what originally motivated you to compare traditional antidepressants with psychedelic assisted approaches like psilocybin?
Yeah, it's a great question because there was a clear motivation, and it was doing some science. We did a trial around 2014, published in 2016 on psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression. So these are people that have pretty severe depression, and they've tried a bunch of stuff, conventional medications, SSRIs, for example. Actually, everyone had tried SSRIs. Some people had tried 14 different antidepressant medications, and none of them had worked. They were all currently depressed. Virtually everyone had tried psychotherapy, and some had even tried electroshock treatment and some other stuff, transcranial magnetic stimulation. Basically, nothing had worked for their depression. And that was the first psilocybin, and in fact, it was the first psychedelic therapy trial in depression of this current renaissance when it was published in 2016. And the results were pretty promising. We did see rapid drops in depressive symptom severity. Everyone showed some improvement in the first week. And the biggest effects were at 5 weeks, and this was only after one big dose and one smaller dose a week prior. So only 2 doses, and only one was a big dose, 25 milligrams of psilocybin. So it was really promising stuff. But when we went into the interview data, so a colleague of mine, Rosalind Watts, had done interviews with every single patient in that study, 20 people, and asked them really simple but important questions like, what happened and did it work and how did it work in your mind? How do you think it worked? How did it feel like it worked? And so there, people were talking about some consistent principles around acceptance, more acceptance of emotion, and a greater sense of connectedness with themselves, their emotions, their body, other people, and a sense of meaning in life. But one thing that came up again and again was that people, without being prompted to, were making comparisons with SSRIs. And they were saying, this is kind of different stuff. This is a different kind of treatment. The SSRIs would take the edge off things, and that would be good if it was fierce, self-critical emotions and thoughts. But when it's taking the edge off positive emotions as well, they would feel kind of flattened, and that they didn't like, and it might impact their sexual functioning as well. That's a well-known side effect of SSRIs. So people were basically saying this is a much better treatment in their view than SSRIs, and that was the inspiration for doing head-to-head. It was really, what people were telling us from that initial psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression trial.
And when was that published? When was that?
2016 in Lancet Psychiatry. Yeah, the first tranche of people, the first 12, and then we completed it in 20 people and published that in 2017, I think.
Okay. That's helpful context. So to deepen into this a little bit, especially with the context today being around microdosing versus SSRIs, recent data shows that more than 4 million Americans microdosed with psilocybin in 2023. And I'm curious, given your deep experience with neuroimaging and the REBUS model, which you may want to explain a little bit, what might be some of the neuroscientific explanations as to why microdosing or generally psychedelics may be emerging as a viable alternative to SSRIs?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is that the microdosing literature isn't that deep, but it's there's work to do, and so that's a good thing as well. It's a fertile space, and when so many people are doing it, you have to ask yourself why. Are they all just taking placebo? Are they all just taking snake oil and getting better because they believe they are? Some people might propose that, but I don't entirely buy it. More plainly, I do think that there's something to microdosing, but it's a very tricky thing to test. It's really hard to do a good trial of microdosing because it requires a lot of expense. To be giving people at the moment in most jurisdictions a Schedule 1 drug. So, tightly controlled by the powers that be. It's hard to get an ethics body or an IRB to approve a study where you're giving people LSD, for example, to take home. And so if they're going to have to take it in a lab, that's going to be a lot of visits over, let's say 6 weeks. And so that's a lot of staff time and a lot of expense. So this is one of the reasons why the evidence isn't especially deep and compelling for microdosing, is simply, but importantly, that it's really hard to do a good trial. So I think it's premature to draw conclusions about microdosing from what's out there. One, because there's not much, and two, there's not much because it's hard to do. So my opinion is that eventually we'll do some interesting trials and I hypothesize that we'll actually find that this can be efficacious. So much work to do there. There has been some brain imaging work with microdosing, giving pretty low doses of LSD, for example, 13 mics, 26 mics. An fMRI study giving 13 mics that showed some patterns of brain changes that resemble what we see with bigger doses, macrodoses of psychedelics. And a really interesting EEG study that gave, I think, 3 different doses of LSD and found a dose-dependent increase in the entropy of brain activity. So brain activity became more varied as a function of the escalating dose. And that was only seen for LSD in that study, not seen with cannabis, and not seen with methylphenidate, Ritalin. So there was no what I call an entropic brain effect, which is a signature psychedelic drug effect. There was no entropic brain effect with the cannabis or with the stimulant, the methylphenidate or Ritalin. So really interesting finding. They're basically saying that even microdoses or very small doses of a psychedelic will do the kind of thing that we would see with a big dose, a macrodose of the psychedelic, albeit at an attenuated level. That's how I think of microdosing, that it's the same essential thing, just at a diluted intensity. Yeah.
And so bring us a little bit deeper into the neuroscience then of how does that compare to something like an SSRI? So when we take an SSRI, what's going on from a neuroscientific lens, and why do people experience what they experience, whether that's good or bad, from an SSRI? And when we take a psychedelic, what's kind of deepening into the entropic brain theory and kind of how it creates more stimuli or brain connectivity? What might be happening with a psychedelic that's different than an SSRI?
Yeah. Well, an SSRI, and the clues in the name, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, will increase the concentration of the brain chemical serotonin in the brain, broadly speaking. So there's more serotonin activity in the brain. But serotonin is a complex enigma. Of all the neurotransmitters or neuromodulators, chemicals in the brain that tweak brain and mind function, serotonin is probably the most complicated and complex, involved in everything and responsible for nothing, a scientist has said about serotonin. You know, something like dopamine, we've got a better handle on. It's involved in reward and focus reward-related expectation and surprise. But serotonin, so much. I mean, it's involved in modulating consciousness. Serotonin tone or release drops as we fall asleep. It's actually at its lowest level during dream sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. But it's involved in mood, as we know. Generally speaking, you increase serotonin tone, you're going to improve mood to a certain point, because too much serotonin is bad for you as well. There's something called serotonin syndrome, where the brain's swimming in serotonin and the body more generally, and it's actually very bad for you physiologically. It can be life-threatening. Serotonin is involved in homeostasis or regulating bodily functions. So much. So, by increasing in a kind of subtle, slow way, serotonin levels in the brain, what we think is happening is that that increase in serotonin is helping you manage stress. It is, in a sense, incubating against stress, sort of buffering you from the jarring effects of stress. It's a bit complicated, but we think it happens through receptors called serotonin 1A receptors that are heavily expressed in stress circuitry. And when they're stimulated, they actually dampen activity and responsiveness in that stress circuitry. And that kind of fits that, okay, so that's going to make me less sort of trigger sensitive and responsive to maybe, aversive stimuli, but maybe also hedonic stimuli. And that's what we see in the brain when we do fMRI studies of people on an SSRI like escitalopram or Lexapro. We see that the brain's blunted in how it responds to emotional stimuli, and more specifically emotional faces. We showed that quite recently in a study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. And in that very same study, which was the head-to-head that you were alluding to, Paul, we also looked at how psilocybin therapy impacted brain responsiveness, and actually found that the two treatments were quite distinct. In that particular measure and paradigm or task of looking at emotional faces, funnily enough, it was the SSRI that had the bigger effect. People had been on the SSRI for 6 weeks and were still on it. It was the last dose of the 6-week program when we scanned them post-treatment or during treatment. And the SSRI had the bigger effect, and it was a generalized blunting of brain responsiveness to neutral, happy, and fearful faces. The psilocybin therapy didn't have such a big effect. The only effect we saw was in the domain of neutral faces. So, yeah, that's not neutral, is it? There's no smile, no sad expression, no angry expression, just a flat expression. And actually, the brain was more responsive to those neutral expressions, which was kind of curious. And what was the contrast there? It was either looking at just a fixation cross, like a crosshair in the middle of the screen, versus looking at someone's face. So in a sense, the brain was more responsive generally to faces, you might say, after psilocybin therapy. And more specifically, it was actually 3 weeks after the second of 2 big doses of psilocybin therapy as a treatment for depression in this study. So what's the short story there? Well, the SSRI will sort of blunt responsivity and especially emotional responsivity. And if psilocybin therapy does anything to that, it's more of a, you might say, a release or a reset or a recalibration or reboot of emotional responsivity. And that actually resonates quite nicely what we see phenomenologically or psychologically when we just ask people, what's it like when you get psilocybin therapy for depression versus what's it like when you get an SSRI as a treatment for depression?
Now, my follow-up question is, and this is a bit of a shot in the dark, so we'll see what you know. I'm curious, has there been any research showing how psilocybin might be able to reset the brain after years of SSRI use? So there's been any clinical research where people have been on SSRIs because, you know, from what I understand, a lot of these SSRIs were meant to be taken in the short term, 3 to 6 months, maybe up to a year. But as we know, a lot of people end up taking them for 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. And if I'm not mistaken, that can change some of the sort of neural circuitry, if you will, of the brain. And I'm curious, have we explored at all how a high-dose psilocybin experience or working with psychedelics may reset some of that neural circuitry after, years potentially of SSRI use?
We haven't. It's one of the knowledge gaps in this space. I would say when we did that head-to-head trial, we had about half of the people coming into the study coming off SSRIs, and about another half just not on any antidepressant medication at all, maybe because they don't like the side effects with conventional antidepressant medication. So what we actually saw was that those who were on meds, conventional meds like an SSRI, and came off, they didn't do quite as well with the psilocybin therapy compared to those who were medication-free coming in. And whether that was because the SSRI had maybe desensitized their brain to the effect of the psilocybin therapy, that's one hypothesis that we've played with. Or maybe it was something more, in terms of their interpretation or perspective, their, expectations maybe related to the different treatments. Maybe those who came in and were medication free and didn't like SSRIs, they were somehow going to be more sensitive and like more psychologically receptive, more welcoming of the psychedelic treatment. I don't know. But those who were on SSRIs came into the study and got an SSRI, got the escitalopram. They actually did better than those who were medication free came in and got the SSRI. And so that was a curious one. Was it, is that like abating a SSRI discontinuation withdrawal type phenomenon? Their brain has known SSRIs and is quite pleased to go back on them. or instead of being so brain centric, maybe it's something again in their feelings toward SSRIs. Those who were on them came off to come in the study and got them again. Were like, well, I know SSRIs. It's a familiar thing. I'm okay with them. So there was an effect of whether people came off their meds or not. It's an ongoing debate. There's a couple of studies that are claiming that you can stay on SSRIs and benefit from psychedelic therapy. One out of Compass Pathways, one out of Matthias Lichty. I'm a little skeptical. Let's wait and see. There are obvious commercial reasons why it would be useful if people could stay on their SSRIs and get psychedelic therapy. It's hard to come off SSRIs. Symptoms often worsen when people come off an SSRI, so it might not quite have been getting them better. Maybe it was causing side effects, but take it away, and unfortunately, it's going to be hard for a period. And actually, even depressive symptom severity and anxiety may get worse for a period. So it's a hard old thing to navigate. So you can see sort of commercially and pragmatically and on a human level, if you could stay on your SSRIs and you didn't have a strong, bias against them, or you didn't see the side effects as especially problematic, so you wanted to stay on your SSRIs, but they weren't doing enough, could you have a psychedelic therapy treatment? You can see why we would want that, So let's see. I think we just need more research there to clarify that one. I'm a little skeptical, those perhaps with slightly less conflicts of interest, like me, I would say, tend to think that you're probably going to benefit best if you do discontinue. You just have to do the work to manage that withdrawal process. So it needs to be very well managed. Yeah.
And to kind of build on that, then before we went live, I had asked you a little bit about ketamine in particular, because ketamine is a legal dissociative anesthetic. Anyone can access it. What might the role of ketamine maybe be in that process, and how does ketamine interact differently with the brain compared to something like psilocybin?
Well, ketamine principally doesn't hit the serotonin system. SSRIs do, as we know from the name. And psychedelics do as well. Classic psychedelics, they stimulate another receptor called the serotonin 2A receptor, heavily expressed in the cortex, the wrinkly stuff that humans have way more of than most other mammals, and especially for our body mass. And we have loads of it in areas that are associated with associative thinking. So that's where those 2A receptors are. They're right up the evolutionary chain, in a sense, really densely expressed in brain that we have that other species don't have so much. And when they're stimulated, they cause an excitatory dysregulation. In other words, the entropic brain effect. They scramble brain activity in a sense, but it's we think a potentially functionally useful scramble. So ketamine actually does a bit of that scramble, at least within a dose range. So at a psychedelic-like, or let's just say dissociative dose, ketamine will do the scramble, but it doesn't do it through the serotonin system. It does it actually through the glutamatergic system, the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter, glutamate. It just does it through a different brain chemical, ketamine. But it does the same scramble. It does the entropic brain effect up to a limit, after which it becomes an anesthetic and people fall asleep. Famously horses, it's a horse tranquilizer, it's used on the battlefield as well as an anesthetic, and it's actually used as an anesthetic, I believe, in children as well. There's some merits to it. It's less likely to be, it's harder to overdose and provide a fatal dose of ketamine. So it's one of the reasons why it's valued more generally as a medicine and as an anesthetic. But yeah, it's not hitting the serotonin system. So if you're on an SSRI that is working on the serotonin system, you can come in and have ketamine because it's not going to compete. It's going to hit a different system. So those two are an easier, combination in a sense. And I believe many people who get ketamine therapy, whether that's an infusion or Spravato, can and do get it, on top of their SSRI treatment.
Yeah, I was talking with a sort of mutual connection of ours, Dave Rabin, who's a psychiatrist and has his Ph.D. in neuroscience. Dave is brilliant. And we were talking a little bit about this relationship between psilocybin and ketamine. And, from a psychiatrist perspective, he really recommended starting with something like ketamine because it doesn't interact or overlap with the same serotonin system. And although the risk of serotonin syndrome is quite low, it still does happen here and there, especially with high doses of psilocybin. And as you mentioned, serotonin syndrome is not a pleasant thing. Now, what Dave also talked about in terms of the context is when someone is coming off of antidepressants, their nervous system sometimes needs help adapting to the emotions and feelings that are coming back line and how to navigate those and manage those, which can also be done as part of ketamine assisted therapy as well. So I think, I know we're focused much more on the neuroscience today, but there is, of course, a nervous system capacity or nervous system part of it as well. There seems to be in the applied practice of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the ideal is that in the future, clinicians have a broad and diverse toolkit. And, it's not one medicine to the exclusion of others, but they can each have their role and be complementary in a sense.
So let's talk a little bit about neuroplasticity, coming back to the 5-HT1A, 5-HT2A, relationship, SSRIs as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors versus serotonergic agonists or the classic psychedelics. Talk to us a little bit about what we know from a clinical perspective in terms of, what impact is SSRI having on neuroplasticity, if any, and how does that maybe compare to a classic psychedelic?
Well, most of the evidence for neuroplasticity across medications, whether it's SSRIs or psychedelics or ketamine, comes from non-human animal studies. So as things stand right now, we don't actually have any clear and compelling evidence for neuroplasticity induced by psychedelics at all. And that might surprise some people as they were thinking that these are, done deal neuroplastic agents, and that's how we get the benefits from psychedelics. People should know that's extrapolation from mostly mouse research. Some of it is actually in dishes, it's in vitro in labs, cells in dishes, and then showing that they'll grow more branches if you drop some psychedelic in there, for example. So it's just we need to manage our expectations in a sense and understanding of where the science is. The reason why we can't see it so clearly in a human brain is it requires invasive techniques to see. And we allow those invasive techniques in a mouse, say, and don't allow it in a human for ethical reasons. So in the human, we're limited by the lenses that we're ethically allowed to use, which are things like fMRI and positron emission tomography, labeling aspects of cells, for example, in the brain. So people are working on using those techniques to see some, we would call it a proxy or an approximate marker of, say, anatomical neuroplasticity in the human brain. But as things stand, all of that evidence is coming from either rodent research mainly or dishes. So SSRIs seem to promote aspects of neuroplasticity in stress circuitry like the hippocampus. And that's mostly animal work that's shown that. In humans with it's a little less clear, and we have to extrapolate from things like gray matter changes. But with psychedelics, the finding in rodents or dishes is that it's not the growth of new neurons. People should know that. That really hasn't been shown in a compelling way, what has been shown in a compelling way is the growth of the branchy bits of neurons, and especially cortical neurons. Remember the wrinkly stuff that humans have loads of? That's where the 2A receptors are. And what psychedelics seem to do is they'll stimulate the growth of these branchy bits. They're called dendrites, or the spines of the dendrites, which are like the thin branches, almost like the leaves of a tree, say. And these are the parts of the neurons that receive signal. They're the receiving end, like an aerial, like a TV or radio aerial. They're the receiving end. So, if I had to guess, I would say that effect probably happens in the human brain. Is it key and core to the action, the therapeutic action of psychedelics? Maybe, but we're having to extrapolate there quite a bit. But if we want to continue on the theme of comparing and contrasting SSRIs and psychedelics seem to robustly and quite reliably, albeit mostly in rodents, stimulate cortical synaptogenesis or spinogenesis. So focus in the cortex and those branchy bits being grown. SSRIs more limited to the stress circuitry in the hippocampus, and a more modest change as well. So what seems to be exceptional about psychedelics is the robustness of the effect with such few doses, which fits the therapeutic work, that with very few doses, you can see quite a rapid and an enduring improvement. So one thought is that it's that anatomical neuroplasticity, like a replenishment, say, of branchy bits, maybe from stress-induced atrophy of those branchy bits in, say, depression or PTSD or a bunch of mental illnesses. So atrophy under stress in the illness, and then a replenishment, synaptic recovery with the psychedelic. That's one model that is quite popular at the moment. It's very biocentric. It's very on the biology. It may well be part of the picture, but I don't think we should neglect the validity and importance of psychological explanations as well. They carry equal weight, in my view. And there are things like psychological insight. Let's just stick there. Psychological insight seems to really matter for mediating therapeutic change with psychedelic therapy.
And is that not necessarily the case with SSRIs? Because I know in the head-to-head you did some comparison there. Is there not the same degree of psychological insight? I mean, I would imagine not with something like an SSRI.
Isn't that a great question? So we developed a new scale called the psychological insight scale after we did that trial. So I didn't get to include it in the study, but you're making me think maybe we've got other measures in that study that looked at psychological insight, and was there a differential impact with the psychedelics really doing it in a big way and the SSRI less so? I mean, I could just say sort of qualitatively from the experience of observing the trial, I strongly suspect that it was a psychedelic specific action. We have seen in other studies that versus placebo, it's psychedelic specific. And the bigger the psychological insight, say when people rate it the next day, the bigger the improvements in mental health. And actually, I've just been writing up a new study that asked the question, given that psychedelic means psyche illuminating, psyche means soul, and delos means to shed light on or illuminate or make manifest, make clearer. So if that's the etymology, these are drugs that do that thing, they illuminate the psyche, then is that valid? Is that actually the main thing that drugs like LSD or psilocybin do? So we did a study to look at that and found endorsing result, as in psilocybin mushrooms did that as their main thing. They promoted visions, which I think is consistent with psychedelic, but also more directly, they promoted psychological insight. So people rated things like, I could see deeply into the human mind. They rated that especially highly with psilocybin mushroom experiences. And interestingly, that psychedelic thing wasn't the main effect of ketamine and MDMA. There were other dimensions of experience that were the main effect of ketamine and MDMA. For ketamine, the main thing was dissociation. And for MDMA, it was feelings of love. They were the main things, the core things to those drugs. So I think it's a useful exercise for passing between drugs that share some similarities, could be lumped into the same category, but could also be passed, could be shown to be categorically distinct in some interesting and meaningful ways. And so that was the aim of the study, to see where we could carve that nature at its joints, if you want.
This is good. So I kind of want to deepen now and bring in your research on the default mode network, and how that relates to emotional regulation. So the question, it will maybe require or invite a little bit of speculation, which you are welcome or not welcome to do. You had mentioned earlier that at these microdose levels, like 26 micrograms of LSD, there was an effect, an entropic effect on the brain, more neural complexity. At very high doses, as we've seen with your fMRI scans, there's a lot of entropy that happens. So can you talk to us a little bit about SSRIs, psychedelics, the default mode network, and emotional regulation in terms of kind of what you maybe have noticed from that, or what might be going on there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll take us back to our initial fMRI work with psychedelics. We published a paper called the Neural Correlates of the Psychedelic State in 2012. And that was the first psilocybin fMRI study. In a sense, the first psychedelic fMRI study. We've since followed up with other drugs like LSD, 2016, DMT more recently, also MDMA. But in that early work published in 2012, we saw the default mode network implicated. What's the default mode network? Well, it's a system of densely interconnected regions that are metabolically hungrier than anywhere else in the brain. They're mostly cortical regions. They're involved in high-level abstract thinking, such as imagination, imagining who you are, so self-functioning and self-referencing, imagining a bunch of stuff like the future, also actually recollecting your past. So there's something about sort of self-narration and I would say narration or stories more generally, or beliefs more generally, that are especially tied to the functioning of this default mode network that is massively expanded in our species. Other mammals, say, would only have a very rudimentary version and probably does, something other than what it does in humans. So we saw the default mode network implicated in the action of psychedelics in this first study, psilocybin, and that was exciting. We saw a few different things, drops in activity, drops in blood flow, and also the first insight around a desynchrony within this system. Its nodes no longer went up and down together, a node in the front, a node more towards the back in the middle. Usually their activity go up and down in sync, even though they're spatially quite removed. But that got scrambled up under the psilocybin. And that was the first time that was seen. It's since been quite a well-replicated finding in the field. There was a paper in Nature by Josh Siegel published, I think, was it this year? Or anyway, quite recently, showing that desynchrony, especially implicating the default mode network. So that early insight that we got is now standing the test of time, that psychedelics do scramble up, especially the default mode network. It's not quite exclusive to just that network. It's a bunch of networks, especially high-level networks, get scrambled up. But the psychedelics do it. There's some suggestions that it relates to ego dissolution, and that would fit if this is a system involved in self-narration and the stories that we tell about ourselves. Then if you're going to scramble up activity or functioning in that system, then you would think it would translate into this thing we call ego dissolution. And so there is a mapping there that seems to be meaningful. SSRIs don't seem to do that thing. They don't seem to touch these networks with the same impact that psychedelics do. When we've looked in the brain before and after treatment for depression, we see a kind of carryover of that big effect of the psychedelic on brain network organization that you see during the trip itself. Networks themselves break down, but they also start to communicate more with each other. So like globally, there's more integration, but within ordinarily well demarcated systems, they become less well demarcated. Their boundaries are breaking or breaching, and they're communicating with systems that are usually somewhat removed and segregated. So we see that in a big way during the trip, but we also see a kind of carryover, like residue of the acute action. We see it post-treatment with psilocybin therapy for depression. We saw that across 2 studies, and we saw that the magnitude of that effect, that carryover-like effect, correlated with improved symptom severity. We didn't see it with the SSRI, didn't seem to touch that measure. As I told people earlier, it touched another measure, brain responsiveness to emotional stimuli, but it didn't touch that property. It didn't really affect brain network organization. For me, it speaks to psychedelics having a big sort of reboot action in the brain. That's how I'd interpret it. Sort of cleaning the slate, sort of factory default, rebooting factory default settings so you can go again. And SSRIs being more like a symptom management strategy to take the edge off things. And that reboot model also fits in with something that's come up in this conversation, the REBUS model for relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. Remember, I was talking about the default mode network as being related to imagination and narration or stories. Stories, beliefs, semantically close. It's a hypothesis of mine that in mental illness, beliefs get too strong. And those beliefs might be cognitive beliefs. They might be emotional in a sense. Those 2 things aren't so distinct. They can also be behavioral in the form of habits. You might think of craving and addiction, but also the habit of getting the rewarding, relieving, say, drug in drug use disorders. So, to reboot the system, a system that's become canalized or stuck in ruts. It's that term canalization goes back to Omri Bergson, 1911, creative evolution, used this analogy of the canal that, things, biological things through evolution and through development can get, carved in a particular way that then define the thing. I think in mental illness that carving process cuts too deep and is hard to escape from and too easy to fall into. But what psychedelic therapy does is sort of level the playing field, level things out, recalibrate things, reboot things. It's like an antidote to canalization. That's what psychedelic therapy does, and I don't think SSRIs really do that. It's more like a management, stress management, symptom management strategy. Yeah.
Incredible. Very detailed and provides a lot of the context. So because of timing, Robin, I'm going to move to some questions.
Sure.
The first question is about self-tracking sort of serotonin levels, if you will. We have Larissa, who has experienced dramatically different responses to SSRIs. Microdosing has felt like a clearing fog from a windshield. Are there any practical tools or tests that exist for everyday people to better understand their own brain chemistry and serotonin function?
There might be people claiming we can do that. I'm not really sure we can yet. It's really hard to look at someone's brain serotonin functioning without doing something like positron emission tomography, labeling aspects of the serotonin system. We can do that, but it costs about $8,000 or so to do a single scan. It's the most expensive brain imaging modality. Can you do a simple blood test to check your serotonin levels? Not to my knowledge. You might be able to pull out some cerebrospinal fluid, but that's a spinal tap. You don't really want to be doing your own spinal tap, or it's an unpleasant procedure. So I don't think there's anything really realistic. However, if you don't want to take a drug, you can manipulate your serotonin levels by manipulating your diet. And there's a dietary precursor, tryptophan, of serotonin that you can manipulate with your diet. But diet's a tricky business and it's a messy business, so I can't give any concrete advice there. Hopefully in the future we get to a stage where we do have these kind of, easy to use, scalable assays. I would say at the moment, things like the entropic brain effect can be looked at through EEG, even consumer grade EEG. So there's some interest there. Even wearables that give you things like heart rate variability. We found that heart entropy relates to the psychedelic experience. We've got some work on that. So there might be proxies that we can get from consumer grade ways of measuring and recording physiology that could tell us something, not just about our health, that's better known more generally, but in terms of how psychedelic could be helpful there. I know the developers of the Whoop wearable are kind of citizen scientists looking at how things are changing, like sleep, in people who use psychedelics pre and post. So there's scope there. And, through collaborations, I'm working on that kind of thing, whether it's Whoop data or Aura Ring or Apple Watches, even EG, in the wild, getting data from people taking psychedelics in the wild, so to speak, to look at how it's impacting physiology. So that's a promising area. Yeah.
Let's talk about a little bit more neuroplasticity and psychological change. There's a question which I'll slightly adapt. Is there any evidence that says if you do a single psychedelic experience, or maybe, we could speculate a microdosing protocol for some period of time, that you can actually retain the positive neuroplastic and psychological changes over a long period of time?
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what there is. There's some mouse work that has shown synaptogenesis with a single dose of psilocybin out at a month, sticking around for a month. So that's pretty cool. That's Shao et al., I believe, SHAO. And actually with Alex Kwan, KWAN, they've done similar work recently showing that happens, and that happens through the serotonin 2A receptor. So there's the mouse work that could support single dose and enduring anatomical neuroplasticity, the growth of the branchy bits. In humans, we're yet to see it. I hear through the grapevine Nolan Williams might have something in traumatic brain injury, TBI, veterans receiving ibogaine, looking at brain anatomy pre and post and seeing some changes afterwards. We've got some data that's actually available in preprint already. Lyons et al., Lyons. It's a preprint, bioarchives, look it up. That did diffusion tensor imaging, which looks at the cabling of the brain, the white matter tracks. And we found that there was a change in tracts that run from the prefrontal cortex into the middle of the brain, the thalamus, for example. And those tracts actually became probably thinner after people's first ever psychedelic experience in their whole lives. We gave them a big dose of psilocybin. 1 month earlier, we gave them placebo, no change in the tracts. Gave them a big dose of psilocybin and saw a change in the tracts. So when that gets published, it's been given a hard time in review for about several years. Yeah, this is what happens sometimes. But we present it as preliminary evidence. You know, we don't know if it's going to hold, but it's exciting if it's real, and it's a thing that happens. You turn on to psychedelics for the first time, and this is a anatomical brain change that seems enduring at least out at 1 month. What it means, we don't know, but people did well in that study on average, as in their mental health improved out at 1 month. There wasn't actually a correlation with the tractography, the tract changes, but we saw both. They just didn't correlate improved well-being and the thinning of these PFC to prefrontal cortex to thalamus tract. So that would be neuroplasticity, and that would be anatomical neuroplasticity, where plasticity in the most fundamental sense means changeability. And so a brain change you could interpret as evidence of a plastic effect. People should know this. Plasticity, if you were to Google it right now, might say, you know, dictionary definition, the ability to be shaped or molded. So plasticity in its most basic sense has nothing directly to do with the brain. It's much more fundamental than that. It means anything, in a sense, in the universe, but typically we think in biology, like a trait, that can change. You're dialing up or down how changeable that thing is, you know, that's plasticity. And if you think, you ask yourself or the world the question, does psychedelics promote plasticity? You're asking, does it promote changeability? How to Change Your Mind was Michael Pollan's bestseller. That's more or less a given, that psychedelics promote plasticity. But what we typically do, because we romanticize the brain, in a sense, is like, it's only real. It's only substantive if we can show how it changes the brain. And if it's an anatomical change, all the better, because then that's really real. You can see it. But why can't you see a psychological change? You can, you know, often that's the biggest change that really matters, is that now someone's not depressed anymore, say, or they're really enjoying life and doing well at work. Like, why isn't that substantive, you know? Anyway.
So I want to, first of all, just acknowledge and give Robin a big round of applause. Thank you for all of the wisdom and expertise. For all of our folks who are here today, we'll get a sort of bibliography of the research studies that Robin has referenced. So if you want to go deeper into that, I also just want to acknowledge, I know there are a lot of questions about the applied practice of microdosing to wean off SSRIs. We wanted to bring Robin in to more talk about the neuroscientific underpinnings, and we will do a follow-up webinar with more of a practitioner or a psychiatrist to go deeper into the distinctions there, because there is so much curiosity and interest. And I'll just give a final plug and then hand it over to John. Robin will be joining us November 5 to 10 in Costa Rica for a practitioner intensive. I've dropped details on that. If that's something that you'd like to join us for, he'll be teaching a couple workshops there and hanging out. So John, I want to pass it over to you and bring us home for the webinar today.
Yeah. The one final plug. I want to talk about the Microdosing Collective. And we're the first 501c3 nonprofit formed specifically to help advance policy reform around microdosing. As Robin mentioned, you know, psychedelics can lead to big changes, big insights, but sometimes small doses can lead to big insights. But regulatory policy that we see being formed around the country doesn't take into account microdosing. And so we want to create momentum, and we want to bring changes to the state and to the federal level so that we are seeing microdosing acknowledged we've made some positive progress so far. We've been able to get the amount of time that someone has to stay in a service center in Oregon and Colorado lowered based on our efforts. In California, we haven't seen policy implemented yet, but we did hire a lobbyist, and we've been working really hard to build those relationships needed to build a foundation for policy change there. I remember, I think it was at Wonderland in Miami about 2 years ago. Paul looked at me, there's about 400 people around us. It was a great party. And he said, if we could just throw parties and talk about microdosing, eventually it'll be legal. And we all laughed. And, that might be technically true, but it's more than just building community and gathering together. We're also, again, trying to do everything that we can through tax-deductible donations, through funding research. We have a chronic headache study that we're sponsoring right now. So if you or someone is suffering from chronic headaches, I want to encourage you to go to our website or just look for the email that we're going to send out to sign up for that study and get involved. We've built a community of over 5,000 people now on our newsletter list, and we're trying to build that aggressively. So tell a friend. If you have been personally impacted by microdosing, like everybody in the Microdosing Collective has been, then we want to hear from you. We want you to add your voice to this conversation. So that is the Microdosing Collective. Paul?
And that brings us home. So Robin, and also make sure to check out Robin's new book.
How Psychedelics Work. Yeah. And it's coming hopefully early next year, but Carhart-Harris, all one word, Carhart-Harris Lab, all one word, .com. You can subscribe and find out about pre-ordering. So yeah, check it out.
Great. Well, thank you again, Robin. We will send out the recording for this if you couldn't make it. And it was really an honor to have you join us for the webinar today. Thank you for everything.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it very much. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for watching. For a deeper dive into the power of microdosing with complimentary practice and extra guidance, check out our best-selling microdosing course. It's a science-based protocol with dozens of best practices so you can customize your protocol to your unique needs and goals. Check out the link in the description below.